when you see an incoming administration change hands with a new president coming in. Congress and the new administration are going to be very busy trying to pass a lot of priorities, things that were talked about in the elections.
The Small Business Rundown is the official podcast of the National Federation of Independent Business, the member-driven voice of small business. NFIB and our members advocate to keep America's small businesses strong and independent in Washington, D.C., all 50 states, and the nation's courts.
Welcome to the Small Business Rundown, a bi-weekly podcast with information on independent businesses' victories and challenges in Washington, D.C. and state capitals. I'm Adam Temple, NFIB's Senior Vice President of Advocacy. Our guests today are NFIB President Brad Close and Vice President of Federal Government Relations Jeff Brabant. We'll discuss NFIB members' top small business policy priorities for the next 2 years with a new Congress and an incoming presidential administration. Brad and Jeff, thanks for joining me again here on the Small Business Rundown.
Thanks for having me.
Great to be here.
Brad, let's start broadly. Can you start by just talking about the current state of small business in America?
Sure. Yeah, I think the best way to start looking at it is where they are. You know, we do a monthly economic survey, and the survey that came out after the election showed a significant jump in small business owner optimism. Now, that's not economic activity yet, but it's that optimism that they think because of the election results that they see better economic times coming, so that the economic policy, the approach to less regulation is going to be beneficial to the small business economy.
Yeah, and looking ahead, NFIB has a series of familiar advocacy priorities as a new term begins, as I mentioned before, with a new Congress, incoming presidential administration. But before we dive into the advocacy priorities that NFIB has, why don't you give us a little bit of insight into how we arrive at those?
Yeah, sure. NFIB is structured very differently than a typical business trade association. We're very unique in that we are solely member-driven. So our members set our policy. Small business owners join NFIB. They know the way we do business is one member, one vote. We send out federal ballots and state ballots, which are short questionnaires on issues that we see coming up in the state legislatures and in Washington, D.C., that we want their opinion on. And so we use the answers to those ballots to decide what our members want us to fight for and what they want us to support.
Brad, you mentioned member ballots, so now we'll take a minute and hear a little bit more about those.
If you're an NFIB member, don't miss this year's member ballot in your state. Please vote today to tell NFIB your position on key state policy issues. It only takes a few minutes to fill out your NFIB member ballot and shape our advocacy positions in your state capital. Go to nfib.com/vote now to tell us what's important to your small business.
Welcome back to the Small Business Rundown. Brad, I know you don't have a crystal ball. It's hard to tell what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, let alone the next couple months. But what do you expect to see the 119th Congress to do in its first few months?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, it's going to be very busy and very active when you see an incoming administration change hands with a new president coming in. Congress and the new administration are going to be very busy trying to pass a lot of priorities, things that were talked about in the election. So some of the campaign pledges that incoming President Trump made on the campaign trail, we expect to see those come up early. We also think there'll be a big focus on regulations, on deregulation, cutting unnecessary regulations, which will help small businesses as well. And we might see a bunch of executive orders that try to approach regulation and get rid of some ones that have harmed small businesses, or maybe restore some regulations that were helpful. And one I can think of is short-term health insurance policies, which were taken away by the current administration. We expect that that's something that the incoming White House will want to reinstate, and that will be a huge help to small business owners who are having a hard time affording health insurance for themselves and their families.
Yeah, anything you think they'll tackle right away?
I think right away we are hoping that they go into taxes fairly quickly. Yeah. You know, as many people know, the tax cuts that have benefited small businesses so much, especially the 20% small business deduction. So the quicker that the administration and Congress take that up and pass it and make it permanent, the better for small business.
Yeah. Jeff, I'll turn it to you. What legislative priorities are on your mind for small businesses?
First and foremost, as Brad mentioned, we're looking at a tax increase in just over a year on over 30 million small businesses. So we really hope, like Brad just said, that Congress will make sure that those tax increases don't go up and small businesses continue to have a level playing field with their larger rivals and are able to go out there and compete every day in the marketplace. Other issues we're concerned about. On the regulatory side, we think, as Brad mentioned, we're going to have a good environment. There should be less regulations rather than more. We should see some rollbacks. Other things we hope they look into are hopefully credit card swipe fees. That's a tricky issue for a lot of small business owners. Anyone who takes a credit card these days could be looking at as high as a 3 to 4% swipe fee. And one of the reasons for that is because it's not a competitive marketplace. And there's legislation out there, it's called the Credit Card Competition Act, that would inject a little bit of that competition and market forces to help the banks and the credit card companies compete just like small business owners do every day. So that's something we're supportive of. We're also looking to try to reduce the cost of healthcare for small business owners. The number one issue for small business owners, going back decades through decades of NFIB research, has been the cost of health insurance. Mm-hmm. And small business owners in the small business marketplace is the most expensive marketplace to buy health insurance in America. And anything that Congress can do to help with that would be welcome news from small business owners. The cost of energy is a huge issue for small business owners as well. We did a big survey last year, something we do every 4 years, to find the top 75 problems and priorities for small business owners. And there were 3 separate issues in our top 10 directly related to the cost of energy. There's the cost of gasoline, the cost of electricity, and inflation in general, which is largely driven by energy, all in the top 10. So small business owners are particularly sensitive to cost inputs. And what's a cost input? That's increased electricity prices, increased gasoline. That makes the cost of doing business more expensive. So we're generally, hopefully, Congress can look to address policies to provide more energy, reduce permitting delays, and make energy more affordable for small business owners.
And Brad, to maximize our chances for success on these issues, what can small businesses expect from NFIB as we pursue these policies?
Well, I think one of the key things we do, and we're going to push really hard, is to make sure that small business owners are talking to their legislators. It is key that those in Congress hear from real small business owners directly. So whether that's bringing them to Washington, D.C. for fly-ins on issue-specific, especially the small business tax deduction, doing events back home, getting them to go to their congressman or congresswoman's office, visiting with a senator, a business walkthrough, all those things are really key to make sure that the folks up on Capitol Hill know that there are real people behind these concerns.
Jeff, before we go, anything else you'd like to add?
There was one big issue I neglected to mention earlier, and that's the issue of beneficial ownership information reporting. And right now, you may have heard from NFIB about a recent court decision that has stayed this burdensome requirement. That this is a temporary stay, but we'd love Congress to take action to permanently repeal this. If this is an issue you're concerned about and this is ownership information that had to be reported to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, I recommend you take action. Go to NFIB.com, fill in an action alert, and let members of Congress know exactly how you feel about this burdensome requirement.
How about you, Brad? Anything else?
I think, one of the best things, we talked a little bit earlier about getting involved. I think it's absolutely crucial for small business owners to get involved and to make sure that legislators understand what it takes to run a business. Most legislators have never been in a private business. They've never run one. So they don't know what it's like to pay themselves last after they've covered all their costs, paid their employees, and everything. That's a foreign concept to most legislators. So I think reminding them what it's like outside of the Beltway is really key. And that means getting small business owners face-to-face with their legislators.
I think that's a good place to leave it. I know we have our work cut out for us, but we're ready to take it on in the next year. I appreciate you guys joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
In today's show notes, you'll find a link to sign NFIB's petition to make the 20% small business deduction permanent. And if there's anything you'd like us to cover on the podcast, please send us an email at podcast@nfib.org. And now I want to thank you, the listeners, for joining us on today's Small Business Rundown. We'll be back every 2 weeks bringing you news and analysis from Washington, D.C. and state capitals so that you, whether you're a small business owner or a supporter of one, can continue to blaze a trail.
The Small Business Rundown is brought to you by NFIB, the voice of small business. You can find us at nfib.com and on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn.